Hello everybody. My name is Dr. Saul Ramos, and I'm going to be covering today an overview of anatomy and physiology. We're going to review first all the information you need to know about anatomy, and then after that, we're going to cover physiology and why these two are most of the time studying together, and what is the importance of human anatomy to understanding how the human body works. This is the list of content that we're going to cover today. Now, we're not going to follow strictly this order. We're going to focus primarily in the anatomy and after that physiology. Let's start with anatomy. The basic concept of anatomy is that anatomy is the scientific study of human parts, or to be more specific, structures. So anatomy is all about studying and describing structures. Anatomy itself do not explain how the organs work, right? We're going to learn that physiology is all about learning the functions, how even the shape of an organ has a reason why the organ has a specific shape or location. So anatomy basically describe um, the location, the features, characteristics of organs, and of course the name that those organs will receive. There are two ways how we study anatomy is based on things that we can see and things that we cannot see. So when we look at the organs without using any special instruments, we say that we are studying macroscopic anatomy. Here I have a picture of a human brain, and when you study the human body using a macroscopic approach, you're looking at organs, the location, the features, the textures, right? All of these things, how these organs, what is the normal appearance and what relationship they have with other organs. If we take a brain as an example and take a small tissue, a small sample of his brain, and then we observe that under the microscope, right? We can appreciate um, the tissues that form that organ. And as we're going to learn later, important here to understand how the human body works is that you need to understand from the beginning or from the most basic structures. What I mean by that is that a human body is composed by 12 organ systems, and um, these organ systems, each system has a specific function. The organ systems are composed by organs. For example, digestive system contains esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, etc. Now, those organs are composed by tissues, and each tissue is composed by many cells of the same kind. So, tissues and cells can only be seen if you look under the microscope. Why? Because they're extremely small, and that is the portion, the study of human parts that can be seen only with the microscope is what we call microscopic anatomy. Now, the next part is for a student or for someone who is studying anatomy and physiology for the first time, there are two approaches how to learn the anatomical structures in the human body. One is based on the systemic anatomy, so looking at the human parts by systems, or regional anatomy. I will say right now that my favorite is regional anatomy, and you will see why in a minute, because this one is studying anatomy based on regions and specific parts is more um, is more exact to what you will see in a real person. The systemic approach states that there are 11 organ systems, or 12 if you think about reproductive as a male reproductive system and female reproductive system. In any way that you study this, the systemic approach basically the goal is to learn the human parts by systems, and we're going to review those 12 organ systems very quick, and we're going to cover just very briefly the main functions. Now, the purpose of this course is to learn each systems in detail, as we move through the class. So just to give you an example, the first organ system we're going to learn is going to be the integumentary system, and this is described in your book in chapter 5. So today we're just going to do an overview. So integumentary system is the system that involves the hair, the skin, and the nails. And the main function of the integumentary system is to protect the internal organs, right, from the outside, from the environment, protect against temperatures, protects against bacteria or microorganisms. And then there's another functions of the skin that we're going to mention later. A skeletal system is all about bones, and the main function of the skeletal system is to support the body and enables movements that can be accomplished by the muscular system. So we need muscles in order for us to be able to move the bones and to specifically to move the joints. So what is a joint? What would be the most simple way to define a joint? It's a place where two bones meet each other and make a connection. So, but in order for that connection to be movable and to be able to move it, you need muscles that pull the bones. And also, in order for the muscle to contract, you need the nervous system to be able to contract and move those muscles. As you can see, muscular system is all about muscles. The muscles that are related to the bones are the ones that we call skeletal muscles. Those are the ones that are related to the skeletal system. That's what they're called by that. And I mentioned that your muscles are not going to be able to contract unless a nerve stimulates them. And that's where the nervous system takes place. The nervous system is one of the most important systems. It's composed by the brain, and at some point we're going to learn in the course that the nervous system is divided in central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. But at this point right now we just need to describe the most basic thing about the nervous system, which is composed by the brain, this big organ located in the head, specifically in the cranial cavity, and the spinal cord, which is part of the central nervous system and is a part of the nervous system that runs through the vertebra. So we're going to learn those as we move through the class and see specific compartments or cavities of the human body. And then the nerves are the nerves are like electrical wires. The nerves are the ways how the nervous system stimulates other organs to do what they're supposed to do. In the case of muscle, for muscle contraction. Once again, you don't a skeletal muscle will not be able to move without a nerve stimulates the muscle. Another important system is the endocrine system. Endocrine system is the organ that produces hormones. Together, the nervous system and the endocrine system are the two major systems that are involved in maintaining homeostasis. Homeostasis, as we're going to learn when we cover physiology, is the way how your body maintains internal balance, how your body maintains the normal ranges of blood pressure, temperature, pH, glucose, electrolytes, etc. So why? Because again, your body and your organs can work only in the most efficient way without suffering any damages is that they have to work in specific conditions. And those two organ systems are the ones that are in charge to maintain that homeostasis. Endocrine system is all about glands and their hormones. So the glands that you need to know: pituitary gland, thyroid gland, pancreas, adrenal glands, in the male, testes, and the female's ovaries. Now, many of these glands, they have secondary functions or they belong to different systems. As an example of that, we're going to learn endocrine system, pancreas, and digestive system. Well, the pancreas is an organ that belongs to both. Why? Because the pancreas has dual function. The pancreas is able to produce hormones that will belong to the endocrine system, but at the same time, the pancreas is able to produce enzymes called pancreatic juices that belongs to the digestive system, and those enzymes are the ones that are going to be important for the digestion process. But at this point, make sure you know the pancreas has an important role in the endocrine system. Same thing with the testes and the ovaries. They are part of the reproductive system as well. So these organs kind of uh, belongs to both endocrine and digestive system. Another system that we cover is the cardiovascular system. As the name implies, cardio means heart and vascular means blood vessels. And essentially, the cardiovascular system is all about how your body is able to move blood to deliver oxygen and nutrients to the tissues. All your tissues, as I mentioned before, are composed by cells, and those cells need oxygen and nutrients in order for them to be able to be alive and to synthesize ATP for energy. Now, the way how the cells of your tissues receive oxygen and nutrients is through the blood, and the blood can be mobilized through your body through this cardiovascular system. The heart, as you probably know, is the main pump, is the organ that is pumping blood all the time. And the way how blood moves is through the blood vessels, arteries, and veins. Another system is the lymphatic system. This lymphatic system, most of the people correlate lymphatic system with immune system or immunity, and that is okay. That is correct. Many parts of the lymphatic system, like the lymph nodes, the thymus, the spleen, they have roles in the immune system, which is the one that defends you against diseases, against pathogens. However, one of the major functions that many students will skip is that the lymphatic system is an extremely important system that regulates the fluids in your body. So it returns fluids to the blood. As we're going to learn in Anatomy 2, once the blood delivers water and fluid into the tissues, the same amount of water that the tissues receive should equalize the same amount of water that the tissues will that the blood will reabsorb. Otherwise, you will have fluid accumulation in the tissues causing edema. So part of that fluid will return to the blood through veins, but another portion will return to the blood using the lymphatic system. Respiratory system is the system that is in charge to provide oxygen to the blood. So your tissues are using oxygen all the time, and every time that the tissues take oxygen for the blood needs to be replenished with oxygen. Well, the lungs are the ones that are going to replenish that oxygen that is in the blood. Also, the respiratory system is important to remove waste products, and the most important one here is carbon dioxide, which is a waste product that comes from the metabolism. Digestive system is the system that is important for the diet, the way how your body get the nutrients that the cells need to perform metabolism is through the diet. Remember that, or we're going to learn in chapter 2 that the major things that our body needs, what we call nutrients, okay, are things like sugars, fats, and proteins. So these three, and there are more, there's one more that I'm not mentioning here, but sugar, fats, and protein, that's what we eat, right? And the reason why we eat these things is because through sugars and fats, that's the way how your cells will use those as a fuel to generate to generate energy. Proteins are the things that your body is going to use to build structures, to build antibodies, enzymes, muscle mass, and proteins in general. So important here is that through the diet, we're able to digest the food, break down the food to the smallest component, and then in your intestine, what we call the process called absorption is the one in which all the nutrients from the food will pass from your intestines into your blood and will be available for your tissues to use them as they need, right? Another system is the urinary system, and please remember, per system, you need to know the basics organs that belongs to each system. And if I'm going to add one here in digestive system, I should add here esophagus. Right? Esophagus is nothing else than a tube that communicates the oral cavity with the stomach. It's pretty important to realize that the esophagus can be found in the neck and in the chest. Urinary system composed by the kidneys, ureters, which are two little tubes that come from each kidney, and they connect the kidneys or to the bladder, to the urinary bladder. Urine that is produced by the kidneys can be stored into the urinary bladder. The kidneys are the ones that control how much water is in your body. And also very important, the kidneys are the ones that clean all the blood toxins. So if you have an excessive amount of toxin substances that are accumulating in your blood, your kidneys through the urine are going to filtrate that blood and make it clean, if you will. Now, we're going to learn about the details of the urinary system later in the class, but for now, you just know that urinary system is composed by kidneys, ureters, urinary bladder, and urethra. And the last two organ systems that you need to be able to just in general to describe the main functions are the male reproductive system and the female reproductive system. The female reproductive system is composed by the mammary glands, ovaries, uterus, and there are other organs like the fallopian tubes and vagina that we're not describing here, just because this is an over review. So just keep in mind that all these organ systems are going to be discussed separately, and they have specific chapters in your book that we're going to learn. So to give you another example here, the reproductive system, we're going to see this in detail in chapter 27 of the book when we basically are finishing the course. So for now, you just know that the male reproductive system is the one that produces the cells, the sex cells, also known as gametes, and hormones that will secure offsprings, and that's the way how the body transmits the genetic information through generations. I mentioned earlier that the best way to learn anatomy and the anatomical structures is based on regions, because this is more towards reality, especially when you do images or tests or CT scans or ultrasounds or x-rays. We don't have systems in the human body. Everything is separate, right? We have everything is packed in a single region. And for example, if you see this picture here, I'm showing the skin of the abdominal region. If you remove the skin out of the abdominal region, then you will see part of the skeletal system. And if you remove the 3 layers of muscles that are in the interior wall of the abdomen, then you will have access to some of the organs that we see most likely something like this in the anatomical models. So why I'm saying that it's important to learn anatomy in regions, more based on regions more than in using a systemic approach. Because if you look at here, after removing the muscles, you have organs like the liver, which is part of the digestive system. You can see the gallbladder. I'm just going to put GB to illustrate the gallbladder. We have the stomach, right? All of these three part of the digestive system. Same thing with the small intestine and the colon or large intestine. But however, we can also see this little organ here. That organ is the spleen. And the spleen does not belong to the digestive system. It belongs to the lymphatic system. So important here is to recognize how the organs are related to each other. For example, where are the kidneys here? Where are the adrenal glands, or where is the pancreas? We cannot see them, and if you use a systemic approach, it will not help you to understand that some organs are behind others, and the only way how you can see them is by removing organs and looking at how those organs relate to each other and what is the location of those organs. This illustration just shows the point that I want to make. If you remove the liver, right, or if you remove the stomach, right, that is the way how you're going to be able to see the stuff or other organs that otherwise you will not be able to see. Notice that if you remove the stomach, the organ that is right behind the stomach is the pancreas. And after removing the stomach, you can see the whole spleen. This little part here is the esophagus. And remember, the esophagus is this tubular structure that goes up, right, through the thoracic cavity. This is the thoracic cavity, the chest. And this is the beginning of the small intestine. So between the small intestine and the esophagus, that's where the stomach will be located. But now we know that you have to remove the stomach, in order for you to be able to see the pancreas and see other structures like this triangular yellow gland that we can see here. And I'm telling you right now, those are the adrenal glands. Those are glands that are on top of the kidneys, and those are the deepest organs in the abdomen. So in order for us to be able to see the kidneys and the whole adrenal glands, that means that we have to remove all these organs. At the end, if you can see, if we take all these small intestine, large intestine, finally we're going to be able to see that that little dark area belongs to the kidney, okay? And that is the key for students to be able to gain confidence and knowing how, learning anatomy based on location, basic shape, and how organs relate to other organs. The kidneys are these very peculiar organs that have this bean-like shape. On top of the kidneys, we have the adrenal glands. Kidney is urinary system. Adrenal glands is endocrine system. So see how by learning anatomy just based on systems sometimes doesn't work that great when you see that the organs in the abdomen are all together. And if you keep going even further, you're going to see that if you remove the kidneys and the blood vessels, then you will have the skeletal system at the end, as we can appreciate in this picture. Now, depending on the study, right? If it's an X-ray, most of the time, the only visible thing that you're gonna see are the bones. You're not gonna see soft tissues too much. If it's a CT scan, tomography, then you might be able to see everything else. But if it's a CT scan, just based on the anatomy, that the kidneys should be located somewhere here, and the other kidneys somewhere here. We know that in this hole called the pelvic cavity, that is the place where you have the urinary bladder. And the urethra is this little tube that connects the bladder with the outside. There is a structure that I mentioned before. The ureters are those tubular structures that connect the kidney with both kidneys with the urinary bladder, right? On top of the kidney, we have the adrenal glands, and then we have also other structures that we just mentioned before, like the intestines, pancreas, the spleen, stomach, liver, that you need to get familiar with how superficial, deep those organs are in the real human body. Okay, now that we covered that overview about the how the organs of the systems are related to each other and the different approaches, another concept that is important to learn anatomy is the anatomical position. Anatomical position just describes the body, the human body standing upright, facing forward. The most important thing to recognize, and this is illustrated by this picture, is look at the hands, that they should be facing forward. So the palms of the hands are facing forward, and the legs are slightly separated. That is the typical anatomical position. the most important thing to also take in account is that when we describe an anatomy, right and left, we always have to take the patient's right and left as a reference. So if I look at this picture and I know the patient is this, I have to realize that this is the right, just because this is the right side of the patient and this is the left arm for the left side of the patient. If the patient is facing, if we're looking at the patient from the back, so posterior view, this will change. Now, this arm, based on the patient as a reference, will be the right arm, and this one will be the left arm. This is standardized, and this anatomical position and the right and left is standard to reduce confusions, especially when we look at the images or like CT scans or X-rays, etc. In the next slides, I'm going to show you several concepts. We're going to learn right now anatomical directions, but in some point we're going to learn anatomical regions, anatomical cavities, anatomical planes, and all of these things are things that will help us to orientate yourself or ourselves whenever we're looking at specific body parts. So one of the things that you need to get familiar or to just kind of replace in your vocabulary in anatomy is front. When we say front, commonly we describe that something is interior. Okay, so interior or ventral describe uh, structures that are more to the front of the body. So direction that is towards the front of the body. Posterior, okay, are the back or direction towards the back of the body. That will be posterior. And this will be something important when we add the word view. So when we look at images or uh, human bodies, we sometimes describe interior view, posterior view, lateral view, superior view, inferior view. What that means is that if I said you're looking at the body from the posterior view, you're looking at this part, and this being your eyes, that's the way how you're seeing it from posterior view. And if you see something interior, it's the same way, but now this will help you to know what is your view based on the patient. Now, superior versus inferior, that's pretty straightforward. What you need to be able to recognize is that there are other definitions like distal and proximal that can be confused by students by the fact that there are specific regions, specifically when we describe the limbs or the extremities, we use primarily distal and proximal when we use or refer to the arms or the upper limbs, and the lower limbs we use proximal and distal instead of superior and inferior. So for the rest of the body, parts that are not the extremities, we're going to use superior and inferior. When do we use that? Most of the time is when we compare something against something. So just as an example, if we know that the stomach is here in the abdomen, or let's say because this is a lateral view, let's say this is the right side of the patient, so this is here, the liver will be here, and we know the lung is here, so we can say, and again, that's when the terms are important when you're comparing two things. We say the liver is inferior to the lungs, right? Which is the same to say that the lungs are superior to the liver. But the only reason why the lungs are superior is because we're comparing that against the liver. If we compare the lungs against the head, then the lungs are inferior to the head, vice versa. This is just kind of, I know it's obvious and just kind of common sense, but just keep that in mind that that is something that anatomy we describe as superior and inferior. compare a part against another part. Lastly, we have superficial and deep, right? Those are kind of terms that are antagonize each other. Superficial describe something that is closer to the surface of the body, while deep describe something that is far away from the surface of the body. If I told you before that the kidneys are deeper in the abdomen, we can say that if we have the stomach, which is more superficial, and we have the kidneys, which are deep, we can say that the stomach is superficial to the kidneys, which is the same to say that the kidneys are deep to the stomach. What about lateral versus medial? The reference here is going to be the midline. What is the midline? The midline is an imaginary line that goes right through the middle of the body. So we describe that something is medial if it's closer to the midline, and something is lateral if it's away from the midline. So this is something that is important when we describe the structures like the bones of the forearm. So in the forearm we have two bones. We have the ulna, which is a bone that goes this way, and then we have the radius, which is another bone that goes this way. So in the forearm we have two bones, and the same thing here for the leg. So which one is medial and which one is lateral? So the ulna, in this case, is the medial bone of the forearm because it's closer to the midline based on the anatomical position. And the radius is the lateral bone of the forearm because it is, again, more lateral when you compare that against the ulna. So the only reason why, again, the radius is lateral is because you're comparing one of the bones of the forearm against the other bone of the forearm. Same thing here in the leg. The only reason why the tibia, which is this big bone that connects to the femur, which is the bone of the thigh, the tibia is medial because you're comparing against the fibula, which is the second bone that runs in the leg, and the fibula is the lateral bone. It's lateral because, again, you're comparing that against the tibia, which is medial, and is the one that is closer to the midline. So that's primarily when we describe something in terms of direction, when something is medial versus lateral. Just keep in mind that midline. And as I mentioned before, the terms proximal and distal are things that we most of the time use when we're referring to the limbs. Like if we go back to the example of bones, we have a bone here in the arm called the humerus. We have, again, the bone here, the ulna, the radius, R for radius and U for ulna. We have a lot of bones here called the carpal bones. And what you need to know here is that instead of saying the humerus is superior to the ulna or the humerus is superior to the radius, when we refer to the structures that are in the extremities, we are going to use the term proximal or distal. And important here, the trunk is going to be the reference point to determine what's proximal versus distal. What is the trunk then? Because you need to know what the trunk is in order for you to decide if something is proximal or distal. So the trunk is this region of the body that basically is composed by the chest, so thoracic region, abdominal region, and pelvic region. So all of this in red that I'm drawing is what we know as, or is known as the trunk. So whatever is closer or attached, and this is the key here, attached to the trunk, that makes that structure proximal. So if you follow this drawing that I made, the humerus is always proximal, okay, because it's the bone that attaches to the trunk. So in the upper limb, in the upper extremity, the humerus is proximal to the radius, to the ulna, is proximal to the carpal bone because is the most proximal bone, which is the one that attaches the um, to the trunk. Now, what about carpal versus radius? Which one of these bones are the proximal and distal? Because the radius connects to the humerus, the radius is more proximal than the carpal bones. The carpal bones in this case is more distal. This proximal and distal again is something that applies for bones, for regions, and it turns very important here with the phalanges, which we have several bones. So if we have, for example, if we take the index, okay, finger as an example, you have 3 bones that form your index. And if this is the tip of the finger, this is the most distal phalange, while this one will be the most proximal phalange, following the idea that are the ones that are getting closer. Proximal is something that is closer to the attachment point to the trunk. Other anatomical directions, prone and supine. So prone describes a face-down orientation, as we can see here in the picture, and supine describes a face-up orientation, like we can see over here. Now that we learned some anatomical directions, let's review anatomical regions. And then after we review the regions, we're going to compare the difference between regions and cavities. I'm saying this early just because we're going to learn that we have things like thoracic region versus thoracic cavity. So what will be the difference between those? So first of all, regions are superficial. Regions are areas of the body that are superficial, and the vast majority of the time they are we use those regions in the medical setting when we're describing, for example, the location of a wound, an injury, a burn in the skin, or maybe it's a cancer or a mole that looks cancerous. And we describe the location using anatomical regions. Important also is that in many occasions, if you memorize and you learn the regions, you're going to find that many of these regions have the name of either a bone or anatomical structure that pass through them. So by learning the regions, you're killing several birds with one stone, because you will know what is the anatomical name of some structures if you already know the regions. You will see that this will make sense as we learn these ones. So in general, the way how we're going to learn these regions is from the most biggest, and then we're going to go to the smallest and the smallest, or subdivisions, if you will. So in general, the area for the whole head is what we call cephalic region. So cephalic region involves the face and all the head, right, where the hair is located. The neck, front and back is what we call the cervical region. The trunk, as we described earlier, is all this in blue, and we remember we use the trunk as a reference to determine what is proximal and distal, and then the upper limbs and lower limbs. The cephalic region can be divided in 2 subregions. The cranial region, which basically, if you look at the picture here in red, describe the area where you have your hair, right? And it's not the same cranial region than cranial cavity. So I'm going to tell you right away. A cavity is a hole. It's a hole that contains something. So just by what you just learned, what the cranial cavity contains will be the brain. The cranial region is the most superficial. So if someone says that a patient has a mass in the cranial cavity, we know that the mass probably is coming from the brain because it's inside. If someone said that somebody has some sort of tumor or mass growing in the cranial region, we know that is something that is growing on the skin or outside of the cranial cavity. So that's is important for you to recognize the difference between regions and cavities. So cranial region, as I mentioned there, is where you have basically your head, your hair. Facial region is the area of the face. And the facial region is just a general term to describe that. Now, the facial region, as you can see here in this picture, has subregions that you need to know. And what you need to know is, or be able to accomplish, is to translate the normal or common term to the anatomical term. So, for example, what we normally call the forehead is what we know in anatomy as the frontal region. What we call the nose will be the nasal region. What we call the mouth is the oral region. What we call the cheek is the buccal region. What we call the chin is the mental region. What we call the ears is the otic region. And the region that it corresponds to the eyes is the orbital region. The trunk has subdivisions. So the trunk is subdivided in thoracic region, which can be seen in red, right? Also, I want to point this out that the dorsal region is just the back, right? But if I said this area here in the back is also the thoracic region of the chest, but in the back, just to clarify that. Thoracic region is not the same as thoracic cavity. Thoracic cavity, again, is deep. Within the thoracic cavity, you have the heart, the lungs, and other organs. The thoracic region just describes the most superficial area. We have also abdominal region, pelvic region, inguinal region. What will be the common terms? For the inguinal region, for example, is the area what we normally call the groins. So it's more this region more than the center. This in green, or this third region that I'm drawing here, that will be more the pelvic region. And the pubic region is the region associated with the genitalia, either in the male or female. That is the pubic region. I told you before that many of these regions, if you memorize them, you're already memorizing other stuff. For example, pubic region is the location of a bone called the pubic bone. Inguinal region, if you know that is the region with the groins, and when you learn in lymphatic system, we know that there are lymph nodes. Lymph nodes are located in the inguinal region. They're going to be called inguinal lymph nodes. Thoracic region can be subdivided into external region, which is in the center. External region is also the area where you're going to find the sternum, which is a bone. So sternum, external region. Mammary region is where the mammary gland is located in females. Sometimes the mammary region is also described as a pectoral region in male. And axillary region is what we commonly call the armpit, right? Blood vessels like arteries, vein, and lymphatic vessels or lymphatic lymph nodes that are located in the axillary region will have the name axillary. So we have an axillary artery, axillary vein, axillary nerve, axillary lymph nodes. So you can see there how important it is to know these regions. And then the other ones we already mentioned, pelvic, abdominal, inguinal, and pubic region. In the center of the back and the neck, we have the vertebral region. Vertebral region contains the bones called vertebra. And the vertebra has different types. So we have cervical vertebra, which if you can imagine, and if you remember that this region on the neck is called the cervical region, that means that in the center we have the cervical vertebra. This region here that is composed by the chest all the vertebrae that are located here, they're going to be called thoracic vertebra. And the lower back, the vertebra that is located here, they're going to be called lumbar vertebra. So vertebral regions describe the regions where the vertebral bones are located. And also the lumbar region is plus the region of the center is also this region and the flank. You're going to see that when we learn the abdominal region in subdivisions, there's a portion of the abdomen that's called the abdominal region is called the lumbar region or flanks. And that refers to the fact that in that specific areas where we have the bones. Below the vertebra, we have a bone called the sacrum. Okay, so the bone is called the sacrum bone, and the name of the region where the bone is located is called the sacral region. Very similar if you see here. There's another extra region that you don't need to know necessarily right now, but I'm going to mention it anyway. The tailbone, also known as the coccyx, the name of the region, coccygeal region. If you look at the abdomen can be divided in regions or quadrants. The regions are sometimes known as abdominal pelvic regions because they do not necessarily just stick with the abdomen, but they cover parts of the pelvic region. So sometimes they're called abdominal pelvic regions. And there are 9. So the lowest, and if we use a little bit of the anatomical terms, if we have these 3 regions, those are the ones that we call superiors. And they're called superiors because you're comparing against these other ones, which this is going to be the middle, and this is going to be the inferior regions. So we use those terms, superior, intermediate, or middle, and inferior. Now, if we look at these regions here from this perspective, these ones are lateral, because the midline, this will be lateral regions, right? Lateral regions. If we use our anatomy, which lateral region is this, the right or left? In this case, remember that we always use right or left based on the patient. This will be the left lateral regions, and this will be the right lateral regions, while this one's in the center will be the medial regions of the abdominal pelvic, of the 9 abdominal pelvic regions. Once again, many of these regions, they have something to do with organs. So let's cover some of them. For example, the most lateral and inferior regions are called the iliac regions, right? And they're called the iliac regions because closer to that area, we have this bone called the ilium. Okay, the ilium or iliac bone is located where the iliac region is located. Hypogastric region is the area that, if you can imagine, if you go deep, you're going to find the lower abdomen that contains the small intestine. But more importantly here is for males and females, the urinary bladder, right, will be located in the hypogastric region. And in the case of a female, the uterus, right, part of the reproductive system, can be found in the hypogastric region. The region in the abdomen where you have the belly button is what we call the umbilical region. And if you know that in a baby, in a fetus, the umbilical cord connects to the belly button, that hopefully will help you to remember that the region of the belly button is called umbilical region, umbilical cord. Laterally to the umbilical region, we have the lumbar regions. And if you remember, just imagine that you remove all these organs. Which bone are the ones that we have in the center? The vertebra. And at this level, which vertebra? The lumbar vertebra. That's why the regions that are lateral to those lumbar vertebra, they're called lumbar regions. Going to the superior regions, we have the epigastric in the center. This word epi is important for you to remember because that means on top of something. In this case, if it's epidermis, which is part of the skin, it's a layer that is on top of the dermis. If we think about epithalamus, it's a region in the brain that is on top of the thalamus, or epicondyle, or epididymis, or epigastric. You will see that in anatomy, many of the anatomical terms, they have a Latin root or a Greek root, and if you know those little details, sometimes it makes sense. So with things about epigastric, gastric refers to the stomach. When you have inflammation of the stomach, gastritis, or the stomach is known as the organ that make um, gastric acid, right? So gastric refers to the stomach. So the region on top of the stomach is called the epigastric region. And then lastly, we have here the chondriac, hypochondriac region, and right and left hypochondriac region. The term chondriac refers to cartilage. So in fact, chondrocytes are the cells that produce cartilage. And this part of the rib cage is pure cartilage. So the region underneath or below the cartilage is called hypochondriac region. If you use quadrants, and if you know that quad means four, we know here that we have the right upper quadrant, left upper quadrant, right lower quadrant, and left lower quadrant. When we refer to the abdomen in quadrants, it basically divides the abdominal region in four big subregions. And importantly here is when patient has abdominal pain. And if you look at deep into those regions are related to specific parts. So somebody who complains about right upper quadrant pain, you think about the liver or the gallbladder, which is the most common uh, side of pain, gallstones, right? Or if you think about appendix in the right lower quadrant, somebody with appendicitis might prefer pain in that specific region. Same thing here with the left upper quadrant. We think about the spleen, the stomach. Left lower quadrant, we think about the sigmoid colon. Sigmoid colon is this specific part of the large intestine. The large intestine is divided, or the large intestine is just a general term to describe the just the large intestine, but in reality, is the large intestine is subdivided in regions. The beginning of the large intestine is what we call the cecum, and coming out of the cecum, we have this appendix, which is kind of like a worm-looking appearance or part of the large intestine. Now, ascending colon is called ascending because we're following the flow of the fecal material or feces. Once material that comes from the small intestine enters the cecum, officially, that material is called feces. And from the cecum, the feces go up. That's why this portion of the colon is called ascending colon. Then the feces at this level then turn from right to left. This is called the transverse colon. Then the feces go down again, descending colon. And then this part of the colon is very superficial, meaning that it's in front. And we know the anus is in the back. So the portion of the large intestine that goes from superficial to deep is what we call the sigmoid colon, and then the rectum and anus at the end. Continue with regions. Let's review in detail the regions that are part of the upper limbs or upper extremities. The tip of the shoulder, right? This is called the acromial region. We're going to learn at some point that the acromial process is a little portion or part of the scapula, what we also know as the shoulder blade. So the scapula has this specific bone part called the acromion process. The name of the region has to do with that whenever you're touching this part of the shoulder, you're touching the bony part of the acromion process of the scapula. So acromial region. The region for the arm is brachial, back and front or anterior and posterior is called the same. The forearm is the antebrachial region, front and back. And here's where the things start getting more complex. Between them, between the brachial and antebrachial, if you're looking at this in the anterior view, this region is called the antecubital. If it's a posterior, this is called the olecranon region. So antecubital in front or anterior, olecranon is posterior between the brachial and antebrachial. The region that we normally call the wrist, back and forth, in front and back, is called the carpal region and contains the carpal bones. The palmar region and the phalangeal regions is for the phalanges, the fingers. And notice here the big or the thumb is called the pollex. Okay, that region is called the pollex. Finally, to conclude this portion of the anatomical terminology, when we look at the lower limbs, we have the gluteal region, which is where the gluteus is located. Femoral region is the thigh, okay, front and back. The region of the leg, if it's the front part, this is called the crural region. If it's the back part, it's called sural region. Now, between the leg and the thigh, we have two regions. If it's in front, where the patella bone is located, the knee bone, we call that the patellar region. In the back of the knee, so in the posterior, we have this region called the popliteal region. Once again, it's challenging for students to learn these regions, but I'm telling you, if you learn them, you're learning more than one thing. Femoral region, the femur, the name of the bone in the thigh, femur. Also, if you know the region, they're going to be femoral artery, femoral vein, femoral nerve, popliteal region. There's going to be a popliteal artery, popliteal lymph nodes, sural nerve. So once again, it's important for you to know these regions and memorize them, because that way when we learn other anatomical parts, hopefully it will be easy for you. If you still remember the names of the regions, you will know the names of organs or bones or nerves or arteries. The region for the ankle, we call that the tarsal region. Remember, for the wrist, where it's carpal region. For the ankle, tarsal region. We said that the pollex was the thumb, and the feet, that will be the hallux. The big toe is the hallux, while the thumb is the pollex. Also, the palm here and the foot is called the plantar region. And the region of the heel is what we call calcaneal region. Now that we covered all the anatomical regions, let's review anatomical cavities. And before I describe these cavities, I want you to notice and remember cranial region, cranial cavity, vertebral region, vertebral cavity, thoracic region, thoracic cavity, abdominal region, abdominal cavity, pelvic region, pelvic cavity. So they're not the same. And again, cavities, as the name implies, are holes, right? So the best way to approach to these cavities is to start from big and then to small. So in general, and using anatomy, if this is a lateral view of the human, we know that this is the nose, and this is the mouth, this is where the eyeballs are located. So we know that this side is the anterior side, right? And therefore, this is the posterior. And this is important because you can see here we have dorsal or posterior cavity, and we have ventral or anterior cavities. So basically what that means is that all the posterior cavities is this one's in orange, while this purple, pink, and green, they're more anterior. Those are the anterior cavities. So the dorsal cavity is a general term, and the dorsal cavity is composed by the cranial cavity and vertebral cavity. Now, which organs are the ones that you will find in the cranial cavity? That will be the brain. Which organs can be found in the vertebral cavity, in the holes in the vertebra? That will be the spinal cord. And what is the spinal cord and the brain? Those are organs that belongs to the nervous system. Okay, so basically what that means is that all the dorsal cavity contains the organs of the nervous system. Now let's look at the anterior cavities. And to see these anterior cavities, you need to look at both views, lateral and anterior view. So in the lateral view, it's important to notice that there is an anatomical structure, specifically a muscle, that help us to differentiate between thoracic cavity and abdominal cavity. And that muscle is the diaphragm. So everything below the diaphragm is abdominal cavity. Everything above the diaphragm is thoracic cavity. Now there's nothing here between the abdominal and pelvic cavity and the structure that will define that as the thoracic and abdominal, the diaphragm, right? But in general, uh, the hole between two coxal bones is where we have the pelvic cavity. Now going back to the thoracic cavity, in this case we're going to use the anterior view. First, all these together is what we call the thoracic cavity. Now the thoracic cavity, and I'm going to change the color here, can be divided in two regions, or I'm sorry, two cavities. The ones that are in the center, right? And these ones are more lateral. So the two lateral cavities are called the pleura, okay, or pleural cavities. The pleural cavities in purple are the spaces where the lungs are going to be located. Now, the center of the thoracic cavity is what we call the mediastinum. The mediastinum is this central portion, and the mediastinum can be divided in inferior mediastinum and superior mediastinum. So the inferior mediastinum contains the heart, specifically the heart. Another name for the inferior mediastinum is the pericardial cavity, while the superior mediastinum retains the name, and you can find here in the superior mediastinum things like the aorta, vena cava, thymus, etc. So lungs, pleural cavities, heart, inferior mediastinum or pericardial cavity, aorta, vena cava, thymus, superior mediastinum. Because the anatomical cavities contain anatomical organs, it's important to know that the organs in the human body, they're wrapped by membranes. So in other words, if we look at the picture of the heart itself is not, how can I say it, it's not naked in the abdominal, in the thoracic cavity. So instead, the heart is covered by a membrane, and the name of those membranes are called the pericardium. Okay, the pericardium, and this is something that applies to the lungs, to the stomach, to all the organs. So if it's in the thoracic cavity, you have lungs and heart. The organs are wrapped by membrane. In the abdomen, they're called peritoneum, but it's the same thing. So these membranes that are the ones that wrap the organs. They're called the serous membranes. This serous membrane has two layers. So the innermost layer, the layer that is in direct contact with the organ, is the one that we call the visceral layer, while the outermost layer, the one that lines the wall of the body cavity, is what we call the parietal layer. if we look at the picture of the heart, this specific layer that I'm coloring here in green is what we call the visceral layer, or in this case, the visceral pericardium. Is the innermost, is the layer that is touching the viscera, in this case, the heart. That's what it's called, visceral. The outermost, so I'll change this color for red, this outermost here is called the parietal layer or parietal pericardium. This is the layer that lies the body cavity, in this case, the pericardium, but it's on top of the visceral layer, and the visceral layer is on top of the organ. This takes importance or is relevant in conditions in which, for example, there's a space between those two layers in the heart, between those visceral and parietal pericardium, and those layers that contain a little bit of fluid between them is called the pericardial fluid. This pericardial fluid reduces friction every time the heart pumps, right? Friction between the layers. If you have an accumulation of fluid between the layers, there's a condition called pericardial effusion, in which fluid accumulates in the pericardial sac, which is again the space between the layer. And that pericardial effusion can lead to cardiac tamponade, which is a life-threatening condition in which the heart is unable to pump blood and to maintain blood pressure. Right? And the lungs, the term is called the pleura. So same thing, the lungs are wrapped by two layers, a parietal layer or parietal pleura and a visceral layer or visceral pleura. If these are the lungs, the visceral layer is always the one that touches the organ. The parietal layer is the one that touches the cavity or lines the cavity, in this case the thoracic cavity. Between those two layers you have a space, in this case it's called pleural space, and between that space what you have is fluid. That in the same way how in the heart that fluid, pericardial fluid, the function was to reduce friction, the same thing happened here with the pleura. It reduces friction in the lungs. If it's an organ in the abdomen, this layer is called the peritoneum. One more here in the nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, they also have membranes. And I'm just going to mention this very briefly. You don't need to know this in detail at this point. Maybe when we learn nervous system, is the meninges. So the meninges are is the connective tissue, as this layer that protects and wraps the brain from outside, and is composed by three layers: the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. At this point, again, it's not worth it for you to memorize those. Just know that every single organ in your body, they're wrapped and protected by membrane. Another concept that we're going to review are the anatomical planes. And there are three anatomical planes. The anatomical planes are important because whenever you need to observe anatomical structures, it's pretty important to know in which way the body has been cut. So we use anatomical planes, and sometimes they're referred as cross sections. There are lines that will divide the human body in parts. So the first one, for example, is called the sagittal plane. So the sagittal plane, if you look at this picture, if you have a way how to cut the human body using a sagittal cross section, what is going to happen is that the sagittal plane will, or the section, will divide the body in right and left, right? Because the way how you have cut the human body. Just think about this eye, right? That will be the right eye, and this will be the left eye. So a sagittal cross section divides the body in right and left. A transverse cross section It's a section that will divide the body in superior and inferior. Okay. Many of the and again, in the clinical or in the practice, when somebody has a CT scan, the CT scan basically take pictures of the human body in a transverse cross-section or in the sagittal cross-section or sometimes even in a coronal cross-section. Whenever, so it's important to know which cross-section, which plane you're seeing to realize which organs you're looking at. Also coronal plane. Coronal plane is the one that is a plane that, if I see, you can see here in the image, divides the body in anterior, so anterior half versus posterior. This is another example of the sagittal cross-section. You can see how the body has been cut. This is how the human body will look in a cadaver. So this is a real cadaver. And if you know that this sagittal plane, sagittal cross-section divides the human body in right and left, which half of the body is this? Is it the right or left? All right, if you said left, that is correct. Why is not the right? Because if that will be the right half, you will see this part. So you will see the part that actually has been removed. So what you're looking at here in this picture is the interior aspect of the left half of the body, of course. So if the brain is divided in a hemisphere, right and left, this will be the left hemisphere, and that's how this looks like. Many of the anatomical models also, when you learn anatomy, will have this sagittal plane. And if it's cut right in the middle, it's called mid-sagittal cross section. The name of sagittal comes from the Greek root, which sagitta means arrow. So sagitta, which means arrow, and if you look at this in the constellation, we normally call this constellation the Sagittarian constellation, is the one that contains the bow, but more importantly here the arrow, Sagittarian. So in the human body, when you look at the skull of a baby in the superior view, the bones are not completely fused in a baby, in a newborn. And these areas that in practice the pediatrician will palpate, they're called fontanelles. So these areas that are areas where the bones have not fused, if you look at this again, that skull from the superior view, looking from the top, you see that these fontanelles and these areas form like an arrow shape. So when somebody was naming this anatomical plane, the name sagitta, which means arrow, is what makes the name sagittal plane. This is just a plus so you know what is the root of the word sagitta and sagittal plane. Coronal plane, in Latin, crown, is, it could be translated to corona, which means crown. So a crown will be placed, if this is a superior view of the skull of the brain, you have these sutures, okay? So, and this is another thing that is important about remembering these planes. In some point, you're going to learn that there are bones in the skull. This is the frontal bone, this is the parietal bone, this is another parietal, and then we can see a little bit of the occipital. There are these sutures here that help us to divide the bones. So, and then this other suture at this level. So this is the front. So this is the anterior part, and this is the posterior part. So this suture is called the coronal suture. The plane is called the coronal plane. And the coronal plane divides the skull in anterior and posterior. And it's called, once again, coronal plane because this, it will be the place where you put a crown, which is corona in Latin. That's why I have this picture over there. The last one is the transverse plane, transverse cross section. This is how the human body looks in the cadaver, a transverse cross section. You can see here that this has been This cross-section is at the level of the chest, actually. So it's not at this level of the abdomen. So this is a cadaver. It's such a transverse cross-section. This is the place where the heart is located. Those are the lungs. And of course, those are the arms. Now, more important here is this. This is a real CT scan or tomography of the abdomen. And just keep in mind that the way how the CT scan look like is you have a transverse cross section, and most of the time what you're gonna see is an inferior view. So essentially what you're looking at here is this part of the abdomen, and you're looking at here from the bottom. So you can see here this is the spine, so this is the vertebra, okay? And this part of the vertebra that I have here is the pointy part, the one that you can touch in somebody's back. So if you know this is the back, you know this is the front, right? And if you know that this is an inferior view, looking this from the bottom, that means that this is the right side of the patient, and here will be the left side of the patient. The importance of that is because these two structures that you're looking at here are the kidneys. So which kidney, right? So this one will be the left kidney, this one will be the right kidney. And it makes sense because we just learned previously that the kidneys are the deepest organs in the abdomen. If this is the front or interior, that means that the organs here are more superficial. If this is posterior, that means that the organs here are the deepest. Now that you know that those two are the kidneys, right? What will be the organ on top of the kidney? That will be the adrenal gland. Which adrenal gland? In this case, the left. Also, we have here this huge organ, which is the liver, and the gallbladder, which is the other that we have here. So, once again, this might require a little bit of time and practice, but that is the importance of anatomical directions, anatomical planes, and hopefully you can see now that it has a real live application. Why it's important to know the terms, the cross sections, and what is right, what is left, and of course knowing an anatomy based on regions more than systems, because once again the kidneys are part of the urinary system, while the liver and gallbladder is digestive system, and the pancreas, which is here, endocrine and digestive system. So learning anatomy based on system will not help you too much, because in reality the human body, you have all the organs at once.